Hello and good evening. Welcome to tonight's webinar, The Truth About Healthy, quote unquote, Foods That May Be Slowing Your Weight Loss. I'm Laura Goldman. I am the registered dietitian working with Premier Weight Loss, and I welcome you to this evening's topic. I really enjoyed this topic and I did my best to keep it brief and keep it simple, but believe me, when I started thinking about different types of foods that would be categorized under this heading, it was a challenge for me to try and pare it down. But don't worry, we're going to keep it short and sweet like I aim to each time and hit on the high points. Remember, as always, it's the quality of your calories that matters. And this is no exception. This topic or this phrase that I use every week qualifies again here. And we'll see why it's also important to be discerning as to what actually counts as quality for calories. What we plan on covering this evening is how we perceive foods as healthy, what cues us in. I also list some foods that may seem healthy but can be deceptive. And we will re-review those priorities and what to pay attention to. I have one challenge for the week for you to try out. And as always, I like to leave time at the end for any questions you may have. And so if you do have questions, you can hit that question mark button at the bottom left hand of your screen, I believe. And feel free to interject if anything comes to mind. So before we get started on those specific foods, it's always nice to have that reminder as to why the quality of your calories matters even more when you are on GLP-1 medications. First and foremost, your fullness cues, because of the medicine, is likely amplified. So you're feeling fuller much faster and for longer, which leads naturally to reduced consumption of food. And because of that, now we are also having a reduced consumption of any nutrients available. And if we're eating, say, the wrong types of foods or foods that don't really maximize that nutrient density that we look for, then we have that risk where we can lose more muscle mass than we intend, maybe a loss of bone density, and other nutrient deficiencies. And because of those types of risks, if we aren't choosing those higher quality calories, then we can actually have a negative impact overall on the progress that we're trying to see. Some people will comment that they see weight loss initially, but if they weren't paying attention to the quality of the foods they were eating, that they may have a number on the scale that they were aiming for, but they are actually feeling less healthy overall, and the labs could show that as well. So we want to avoid that situation as much as possible. Moving on to how we're perceiving foods as healthy. There's a term that goes around called the health halo. So sort of assigning this perception of foods that can be healthy with a few buzzwords. This is oftentimes happening with the food industry, and it can be a marketing tactic in many ways. And what happens is we're pointing out some of the good aspects or good characteristics, or finding a nice way to frame food to make it seem healthy. I gave this example of the sun chips over here because I think many people initially thought that sun chips were baked. It gives you the visualization of baked in the sun. But if you look at the packaging, they're not baked, they're still fried, and actually, from the ones that I've seen, the fiber content is not much different than regular chips. And so this is an area where even I, when they first had come out, had assigned a health halo to it. And don't get me wrong, they're delicious, but that is one of those examples that I could easily point to. But we can also look at other foods or buzzwords where there may be a healthy aspect to the food. So some people find organic to make them feel healthier. Sugar-free is sometimes something we are looking for. Fat-free used to be the craze. It's not something that I look for on a food label, but that was very popular for a while, and so sometimes that might draw people toward that. And you see here also some of these words don't actually mean healthy. They might be a word that was sort of coined for certain foods, like superfood, which is not really an official term. It's bestowed upon certain foods that have quite a few nutritious aspects, but again, that can still become unhealthy. Gluten-free for a while became a word for healthy, not just for people who needed to be gluten-free, such as those with celiac disease, but people often took that on as everyone who's gluten-free is healthier, which is also something we know is not the case. But I'm sure you remember when you'd see food labels covered in gluten-free to try and get that type of sale. And really fast, not to try and wax too poetic on some of these words, but natural is actually a word that has no legal definition in terms of when we're labeling food. So that word is kind of a whole lot of nothing when it comes to seeing it on a food label. But it sounds good. And so then we can, again, give that health halo to that food. Also, there may be ingredients in a food that people perceive as healthy. Sometimes people are looking for agave versus processed sugars. My impression again is really there's not much difference there, but it can draw some people in. Also, these so-called superfoods like chia seeds or quinoa, kale, those may be promoted a little bit more on certain foods. And here we can also talk about packaging. Sometimes packaging will look a little more earthy, and therefore we perceive that as being a healthy type of food. But it's important to know that this does not mean health food. It does not mean it's the best food. And in fact, it can steer us away from healthier choices. With that in mind, I wanted to also highlight some foods that are, I would say, misunderstood to be healthy. And I want to be very careful here in that many of these that I list have the potential to be healthy. However, there are certain either companies or ways that they're made that can make them go from a healthy start to off the rails a little bit. So for the first example, I have granola or health cereals listed because you might see that it's made with whole grains. You'll see that there's a lot of fiber. However, there are many, many granolas out there that are loaded with added sugars to try and make them taste good. There can also be cooked with quite a bit of oils. And serving sizes you'll often see if you're looking at the food label. You can see quite a few calories for only about 1/4 of a cup. So even if it is something that's overall pretty healthy, the portion makes the poison is something I like to say. And so even too much of a good thing can then become detrimental. Ideally, if we're looking at granola or health cereals, try and aim for things that are less than 6 grams of added sugar per serving and look for at least 3 grams of fiber or more. Moving on, I think it's very important to point out fruit juices, and smoothies. Smoothies, I think, can be very deceptive, and I am someone who will get on a soapbox and actually preach against fruit juices as much as possible, just because these are where it can become too much of a good thing. When we're talking about fruit juices and dried fruits, now we're taking a fruit, but we're concentrating the amount into a smaller size or into a liquid form, which is easier to drink, easier to consume, but we don't get full as quickly. So then we can eat more, 2 or 3 times as much. Or if we're looking at smoothies, it's usually quite a bit of fruit. So we're basically making fruit juice in a large quantity. And if we're not adding any protein, we've not done ourselves a whole lot of benefits. And my ideal recommendation is if you are eating something that is fruit forward and you're not making a reasonably sized smoothie with protein, aim for choosing whole fruit and go 1 portion at a time. Fruit does have calories, fruit does have sugar, and so again, we want to have them, but we don't want to overdo it. I'm also touching on the low fat or fat-free versions. Frequently, those terms can also translate to added sugar. Since fat equals flavor, then that can take away the flavor, make things taste, frankly, gross. So we want to make sure that we're looking for something that has fat in some amount instead of going low or no fat, because chances are you're going to see more sugar there. Also, it is important that we have some fat in our diet because it can help us with the absorption of nutrients such as vitamins A, D, E, and K. Also, protein bars, they're not all the same. Acai bowls and any other type of diet food out there, those are ones where I definitely say buyer beware. There are some that are healthy, are helpful. You've heard me mention certain protein bars, protein drinks, but there are others that are ultra processed and full of extra stuff, and especially added sugars. These tend to be on the more trendy area, and they're relying a lot on marketing. So make sure that if they come with food labels or nutrition facts, to read up on them, because you may be fine, it may be a healthy food, but you just want to aim for a smaller portion, or try and find some that are actually meeting the nutrition goals you're looking for. To move on how to figure out what to prioritize, I wanted to keep it fairly simple, but first and foremost, we're looking for protein first. As always, we know it helps with satiety, and we know that protein is going to help us preserve muscle mass. That can come from plant sources, animal sources, whatever protein works best for you, I'm fine with. The second area we want to look at is for nutrient-dense foods, but also high-volume foods, because this way you won't get that extra hunger. Foods that are high in water, fiber, and nutrition, so lots of micronutrients, you can feel full, but you're going to end up with fewer than 400 calories. This will be 400 fewer calories a day than you would normally eat if you were eating the more calorically dense but not nutrient dense foods. And then priority number 3, I said be a food label critic. So don't get sold by those words of organic or natural. Look at the nutrition label, aim to focus in on the calories, look at those added sugars, your protein content, and the ingredients. Oftentimes you'll hear people encourage short lists, and that is a good starter. I will grant you, though, there are some foods where the ingredient list might be long, but it's still okay. So it kind of depends on what label we're looking at. But it's very important to look this over. And of course, if you have questions about the ingredient lists, you can always reach out to me or one of the staff members at Premier Weight Loss. And we're already here at the challenge for the week. I wanted to do something different, so I only aimed on one challenge. And my challenge to you is to do a healthy halo audit. Look back on some of the foods you've been choosing to eat, or maybe have thought about buying, thought about eating because you felt like it was healthy, but you didn't go to confirm it. Try to pick 1 to 3 of these foods and actually take a look at the label. Were you sold by the buzzwords in the marketing, or did you pick an overall healthy food? Aim to look at sugar content, your fiber content, or protein. Some examples I give here on the right, because I remember they were very, very popular when I was younger, were the Quaker oatmeal bars, chewy variety. Those tend to be quite high in added sugars. And the Nutri-Grain bars are also fairly high in added sugars. So I think it's very important to take a look and see what are the bars that you're picking. So to put this all together, just remember that one healthy ingredient in your food doesn't make the whole food healthy. Try and see beyond the trendiness and see beyond the marketing words and read those labels to maximize the benefits that you're looking to get. Remember that the top priorities are when we have protein and whole, minimally processed foods. And those are what we want to try and get in as much as possible. And from time to time, audit your foods as well as yourself to see what you're choosing and try and maintain that momentum of your healthy choices. And with that, I'll leave it open to any questions. Okay. Well, with that, I hope you found this informative and helpful, and I look forward to hearing about any nutrition audits that you might do. And I would love to hear about any health halos that you've managed to identify. If you have questions in the future, please reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff. They can get you in touch with myself. I'm always happy to answer. And I hope you have a wonderful night, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.